Hello everybody, how's it going? Welcome back, hopefully, to D&D University. We are here to teach you about Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition. My name is Colby. I am a longtime player of D&D, a sometime YouTuber on the subject, and I suppose I will be your professor if you'll have me. This is course 102, the second in a series of 5 courses that will try to teach you the basics of the game that I love, that so many of us love. And by the end of this series, you should have a pretty good working understanding of the game, core concepts and everything that will get you ready to play. Before we begin, just a reminder, if you enjoy the content, please be sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any future courses and episodes. Now, if you haven't seen Course 101, the first of this series, I strongly suggest that you do. Today, we're going to be learning about how to create your character in Dungeons & Dragons. There are a lot of choices to consider, and I think having the sort of foundation that the first video provided will be useful and helpful. When it comes to creating a character, to be honest with you, character creation might be my favorite part in the entire game, as will become readily apparent to anyone who watches the other videos that I put out on this channel, specifically under the D&D optimized playlist. I hope that by the time you're done with this series and you feel like you've got a good foundation, that you will check those out and see if you find them interesting and or entertaining. I just really enjoy dreaming up new characters, finding ways to make them both interesting and fun and also powerful in game. We're not going to dive today too deep into all of the nitty-gritty details and options when you are creating a character. We'll save the real deep dive for later courses. For now, we'll try to go over everything from kind of a high level or maybe medium level view and give you at least a basic understanding of what decisions you're going to need to make as you're creating your character and how it might affect your character that you create, and therefore how it might affect your game and your story. First off, if you don't already have one, as I mentioned last time, I strongly recommend getting yourself a copy of the Player's Handbook, or at least finding access to it online. It's available from several places. My favorite site, as I've mentioned, is D&D Beyond. They are not a sponsor yet. Anyway, it will be very useful to look to and use as a reference, maybe while you watch the videos or maybe after you've watched the video, to kind of review some things. I think it will be very helpful and important to have. And especially for today, I strongly encourage you to get a character sheet. I would in fact recommend having a character sheet on hand to reference while you watch the video today. Although I will be kind of trying to share screenshots and things of a character sheet so that you can sort of look to it and know what I'm talking about and things. But I think it would be very useful to have, at the very least, when the video is over and you go to create your character. Obviously you're going to need to have one. So again, they're available online pretty much. Just if you just do a search, for D&D 5th edition character sheet, you should be able to find something that you could print off if you'd like, or again, you can get a digital copy available in lots of places. You'd create an account on D&D Beyond if you wanted to create a character there and use their sort of digital character sheet. Back in the day, we call it a sheet still, because back in the day, you used to have like a physical copy of your character sheet, and you'd constantly be, updating it and erasing things on it and making changes to it as your character evolved and progressed throughout the game. I find it a little easier personally to do it online nowadays, but do whatever feels easiest and most natural for you. Let's start off with what I think is the most important decision that you will need to make about your character: your class. Your class will determine, more than really any other decision you make, what your character will and will not be able to do in-game, what it will excel at, and maybe what weaknesses it may have. Think of your character class as an archetype or a role that you would want to play. I'll go over a few of them very briefly, just to give you an idea as to what some of your options might look like. We'll go over 4, some of the more sort of common archetypal character classes, but know that there are, as of this recording anyway, 13 classes to choose from. We won't get into all of them. Later courses, we will. So the first class that I will mention is the Barbarian. Barbarians are typically strong, healthy, frontline warriors. They typically wear not a lot of armor, maybe light armor, medium armor. And they often like to fight with big weapons. They enter a frothing rage when they fight, and that rage fuels their attacks, makes them do more damage, and also helps them shrug off damage that might do more harm to another less strong, less raging character. Next up, we've got the Cleric. A Cleric is sort of like a priest. Sort of. Maybe more like a priest who wears chainmail armor and wields a heavy mace and a shield into battle. They can heal their allies with divine magic, but they can also harm their foes with righteous fury, channeling power granted them by their god, of which, by the way, there are several in the world of D&D to choose from. They're also fueled by their faith. They are able to cast spells. They particularly are strong against enemies that are undead, so skeletons, zombies, and the like. Next up, we've got the Rogue. A rogue is a bit of a scoundrel. They're useful, very useful to have in a party, as they tend to be expert at stealth and sort of scouting ahead, and they're good at finding hidden traps that might pose a danger to the party and in fact disarming those traps. They're also great at picking locks to maybe a chest that would hide some treasure, or to a door that your enemies don't want you to be able to get behind. And of course, no one is better at putting a well-placed dagger or short sword in a monster's ribs than a rogue. The last class that we will talk about is the Wizard. A wizard is a master of the arcane arts. They study ancient magics, and they go into battle equipped with little but a robe, a staff, and their all-important spellbook, which is filled with magic incantations that will allow them to cast spells of all varieties, throwing lightning bolts, causing their enemies to fall into a magical slumber, or even fly. There are few characters as versatile as the Wizard, as there is really a spell for almost every situation. The question is, with little ability to wear armor and a somewhat frail constitution, will you be able to survive long enough as a wizard to use all of those spells in your arsenal? So, like I said, these are 4 of the currently 13 classes available to players in Dungeons & Dragons, and it kind of gives you an idea as to what types of options and characters might be available for you to play as. Among those not mentioned are bards, monks, druids, warlocks, fighters, rangers, and more. Most of them will be listed in great detail in the player's handbook. I would take some time reading through the description of each and deciding which one sounds like the most fun for you to play before you take this first step and create your character. One thing to keep in mind as well, each class has a list of several subclasses that further the abilities of your chosen class, often in very important and impactful ways. We will get into subclasses in later courses, but one concept I would like to introduce here is hit points. Each creature in the game, including you, has a certain number of hit points that represent their health or their survivability. When your hit points are reduced to 0, you fall unconscious and you may die. Again, we'll talk more about this later, but just know for now that each character gains additional hit points every time they gain a level. And the number of hit points you gain is determined mostly by your class. The hardy barbarian gains more hit points per level than any other class, and the frail wizard is among those who gain the fewest. And that's important to keep in mind when you're considering how survivable you want your character to be. Now, once you have decided on your class, you will need to pick your race. Races in D&D are varied and sundry. Some people prefer to use the term species, but basically you'll need to decide if you want to be a human or something a little more exotic, like an elf or a dwarf or a gnome, for example. You could even go a little more exotic than that and pick a race descended from dragons called Dragonborn, or a half-human, half-monstrous-looking orc, or a demonic tiefling. There are literally dozens to choose from, and each come with their own unique flavor and special abilities. Some can see in the dark, some are exceptionally lucky, some are especially hearty against certain types of damage in the game, and some can even spout fire. As with the classes, take some time perusing the different races that are available to you to choose from, and pick the one that sounds the most interesting, fun, and or powerful for you. Keep in mind, of course, that depending on which race you pick, you will get certain bonuses to your ability scores. What are those? Let's talk about your ability scores, as that is the next choice that you will have to make. So we touched on these a little bit in Course 101, but these are your character's physical and mental attributes. There are 6 of them: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Let's talk about each of them a little bit. The game rules generally cap each ability score at 20, with a few exceptions, and the higher your ability score, the greater benefit you will have when you roll the dice to try and perform something in-game that is dependent upon that ability. So, for example, if you want to hit a monster with a melee weapon like a sword or an axe, most of the time you will roll the die and add a bonus to that roll based on your strength score, among other things. If you want to slink through the shadows stealthily, or hit an enemy with a ranged weapon attack, like from a longbow, for example, you would get a bonus based on your dexterity. The higher your constitution score is, the more hit points that you will gain each level. So therefore, the harder your character is to kill. Everybody wants a high constitution, right? A character that's trying to recall information that they may have once known, or a wizard casting a spell, will benefit from a high intelligence score. A character trying to gain insight into someone else's true motives, or a cleric casting a divine spell, would get a bonus based on their wisdom score. And finally, a character trying to persuade or even threaten someone else to do something that they might not otherwise be inclined to do would want a high charisma score and receive a bonus from that. Now, there are several ways to determine your ability scores, and I will mention them each briefly with a recommendation for which one to use. There's the point buy method, where you have a certain number of points to spend that you get to allocate toward raising your different abilities. There is the dice roll method, where you let fate decide, essentially, what your ability scores will be by rolling the dice. And then there is the standard method. If this is your first time creating a character, I'd strongly recommend just going with the standard method. It's great and fair, and basically the way it works is you get one ability score of 15, one of 14, one of 13, one of 12, one of 10, and one of 8. So one for each of the ability scores, and you just pick which to allocate where. Keeping in mind, of course, that your character class is going to really want 1 or 2 of those ability scores to be really high. Again, for example, if you're a barbarian, you're probably going to want to put that 15 in your strength. If you're a rogue, you might want to put that 15 in dexterity. A wizard intelligence, a cleric in wisdom, etc. Right? Now, once you have decided your starting ability scores, you can then assign the additional bonuses that you get to your ability scores from your race. Let me explain. Up until recently, and you will see this in the player's handbook if you look, each race was given specific ability score bonuses. For example, a high elf received a +2 to their dexterity and a +1 to their intelligence. A mountain dwarf received a +2 to their constitution and a +2 to their strength. A human simply received a +1 to every single ability score. In November of 2020, Wizards of the Coast, the creators of D&D, released an update to their rules that said from now on, so long as your dungeon master agrees with this, ability scores from a race need not be tied to specific abilities, or I should say ability score increases from a race need not be tied to specific abilities. So if you wanted to be a high elf, you could take that +2 that normally you had to put in dexterity. You could take that +2 and put it in, say, strength, and the +1 that was supposed to go to intelligence to wisdom, or whatever you wanted. Instead of being forced to put a +2 into dexterity and a +1 into intelligence, you could put a +2 into whatever you wanted and a +1 into whatever you wanted. They just can't be the same ability score, giving you a total of a +3 in one thing, right? Personally, I really love this ruling. I think it just does a great job of letting us kind of create the character that we want to play and gives us a little more freedom in doing so. You know, maybe you want to be a dwarf from the mountains. That's part of your character's story. But you want to be a more dexterous and or charismatic dwarf as opposed to the typically strong and hardy, other dwarves from the mountains that are your kin, right? And this gives us the ability to do that. Now, one thing to note on ability scores. The bonus you receive to your die rolls is a plus or sometimes a minus that is different from the actual ability score itself. This is a little confusing, something I think Wizards of the Coast maybe could have done a little bit better job on, frankly. But for example, an ability score of 10 is considered average and so receives no plus or minus to a die roll. A 12 would be considered above average and would get a +1 to a die roll. 14 is even better and would get a +2, and so on, all the way up to an ability score of 20, which would receive a +5 to any associated roll using that ability score. As a quick example from the last course, 101, we talked at one point about you trying to persuade the bartender to give you your drinks for free, right? Your DM might say, your dungeon master that is, might say, okay, you need to roll a charisma check to see if you succeed. And the bartender's pretty grumpy, so you need to roll a 15 or better on that 20-sided die roll. You roll the dice, you roll a 12. Now, a non-charismatic character who had, let's say, a charisma of 10 would get no bonus to that roll, and so they would have failed the check. They rolled a 12, they needed a 15, they failed to persuade the bartender, they got to pay. Fortunately for you, let's say, you have a 16 charisma, so you get a +3 to your charisma rolls, charisma checks, right? So your roll of 12 is now considered a 15, and that's what you needed to hit, so you succeeded. Congratulations, drink up. We'll get into the math a little bit more later, but just keep this in mind as you're determining how to allocate your ability scores. So, what about your equipment? Every warrior needs some armor and weapons, and every magic user needs a staff or a wand, some robes, and maybe a spell book, right? There are a couple of ways to determine what equipment your character starts the game with. The more complicated and advanced way is to roll a bunch of dice and figure out how much gold your character has that they can then use to buy equipment. The simpler way, and the way I recommend, is to just take the standard equipment that is offered to your class as listed in the player's handbook. This is definitely the route that I would recommend going if this is your first time making a character. And typically you will be asked to choose between certain types of weapons and armor, and then other standard adventuring equipment like backpacks and rations, camping gear, basically. So the question is, how do you know what to pick? The first thing to discuss that will help us decide what to pick is to learn about proficiency. Every character has something called a proficiency bonus, and this is simply a bonus that applies to our die rolls when we try to do something in the game that we are considered proficient in. We can be proficient in a certain skill, and we'll talk about skills in a moment, or we can be proficient with different armor or different weapons. Your proficiency bonus, every character's proficiency bonus starts at a 2, and it just increases as you level all the way up to a 6. So you start as a +2, and you end at level 20 at a +6 as far as your proficiency bonus is concerned. So therefore, trying to do something or use something that you are proficient in greatly increases your likelihood of success. Stay with me here. Let's take a look at weapons. Each class has a proficiency with certain types of weapons. Some classes, like the wizard, for example, are limited to proficiency in very few weapons. They're proficient in using daggers, darts, slings, quarterstaffs, and light crossbows, and that's it. And there's lots of different kinds of weapons in the game. Other classes, like the barbarian, are proficient in all weapons. So if it's a weapon, the barbarian can use it and enjoy their proficiency bonus when they try to do so. Most classes fall somewhere in between, right? They have a limited number of weapons they can use. If you try to use a weapon that you are not proficient in, you won't get to add your proficiency bonus when you roll the die to see if you are successful in your attack. And it will therefore be much harder for you to successfully hit your target. So let's take another example from the last course, right? We talked about you are a barbarian, you have a sword, and you're trying to hit a goblin, right? So let's say the dungeon master says, all right, you need to roll a 12 or better in order to hit this goblin. Okay. You roll the die, and you roll an 8. Now, you're 4 away, right? And you might think initially, I failed. However, keep in mind, we get to add a couple of things here to see if we hit. We get to add our strength bonus, because we use our strength attribute when we're making melee weapon attacks, as I discussed. And as a barbarian, let's say you have a strength of 16. So you roll the die, and a 16 gives us a +3 to our chance to hit. That takes us from 8 to 11. We're still shy, right? However, because we are proficient with the sword that we tried to hit the goblin with, we get to also add our proficiency bonus to that roll. And our proficiency bonus right now is a 2. So we rolled an 8, we get to add 3 for our strength, and on top of that we get to add our proficiency bonus of 2, giving us a total of +5. So 8 plus 5 is 13, and we only needed a 12, so we hit. And it's a good thing then that we had a good strength score and that we were using a weapon that we were proficient in. Assuming, then, that we are only going to be interested in using weapons that we are proficient with, what else do we need to know about the various weapons in order to decide which to take when we're considering what equipment we want to start with? We will go into a little bit greater detail on this in the next video, the next course where we discuss combat. But for now, just know that each weapon has a die associated with it in order to determine how much damage that weapon does. So a dagger may have a D4 associated with it. A let's say a quarterstaff may use a D6, right, a 6-sided die, and a longsword may use an 8-sided die, a D8, when trying to determine how much damage it does when you hit with it. The higher the damage die, obviously, the more potential damage you will do to your target if you land an attack. Also, some weapons are considered melee and can usually be best used in close quarters combat when you're kind of right next to your enemy. So swords, axes, etc. And others are ranged weapons and can be best used from a distance. Bows, crossbows, etc. Try to pick a weapon, then, that has a high damage die and that represents the type of fighting that you will want to do. Melee fighting or ranged fighting, right? Okay, so that's weapons. What about armor? Similar to weapons, you also want to make sure that you are proficient with a certain kind of armor before you try to wear it. In fact, with armor, you are even more severely punished or penalized if you try to wear a type of armor that you do not have proficiency with. Unfortunately for wizards, for example, they are not proficient in any type of armor. So if they try to wear any, their dice rolls are heavily penalized and they cannot cast spells at all, which is terrible for a wizard because that's kind of their thing. So you don't want to wear any armor unless you can somehow find a way to become proficient in that armor. Now, there are ways that you can gain proficiency with armor, with different armor types. We'll discuss those later. But as far as the types of armor that you can potentially be proficient in, there are basically three types of armor. There's light armor, which consists essentially of leather armor. There's medium armor, which is like hide armor and scale mail armor. And then there is heavy armor, which is like your chain mail and your heavy plate mail armor, which you might imagine a medieval knight wearing into battle. So what's the difference? How does armor essentially benefit you in game? We'll get into it in more depth in the next course, but for now, just know that each type of armor has a number associated with it called an armor class, or AC for short. The higher that number is, the higher your armor class, the harder you are to hit. So the higher your AC, the more durable you are. And the same goes for your enemies. If they have a high AC, a high armor class, you're going to have to roll a higher number when you attempt to hit them. One last thing that I'll mention only briefly here that you might need to make a decision about. Spells. Now, not all character classes have the ability to cast spells. And some of those who do don't get the ability to cast spells right at level 1. But for some classes, like a wizard, for example, or a cleric, you will need to choose your spells here before you're ready to move on. We will discuss that in greater detail in Course 104 when we take a deep dive into spells specifically. For now, with your class chosen, your race chosen, your ability scores assigned, and your equipment equipped, and maybe your spells chosen, there's really only one thing left to do. Figure out your character's story. Who are you? Where did you come from? What is your personality like? What's your history? What are your personality strengths and weaknesses, for that matter? The truth is, you can get as detailed or as vague and generic as you want to here when you're creating your character's backstory, right? It's your character, after all, and a lot of this will sort of develop as you play them. But there is one last decision to make as related to your backstory, and it might help you, at the very least, kind of get the ball rolling when you're trying to figure out your story, right? You need to choose what's called a background. There are dozens of backgrounds to choose from, and they're available to every class and race combination. There's no limit on which background you can choose, generally speaking. This background will give you like a thread to start weaving your story with. Are you a soldier? Are you an acolyte? Are you a scholar? Perhaps you are a wandering minstrel, or a nobleman's child. And maybe you grew up as an urchin in the city streets, or you might be part of a mercenary band who kills for hire. Whatever you decide, it's important to understand that each background choice serves both a story but also a mechanical purpose. For each background will give you an opportunity to apply your proficiency bonus, remember what that was, to a certain number of skills. So what are skills? Think of skills like the out-of-combat version of your weapon proficiencies. In combat, as we've discussed, if you are proficient, say, with a short sword, then when you attack with that short sword, you get to add your strength bonus to the roll of the die and your proficiency bonus to the roll of the die, right? You generally use skills in much the same way. But instead of trying to hit something with a weapon, you might be trying to do something that requires you to be acrobatic, like swing from the chandelier, like we talked about in the last video, right? Or persuasive, or insightful, or stealthy. There are 18 skills in all. I won't go over all of them here, but if you are proficient in a given skill, then you get to add your proficiency bonus when your dungeon master asks you to make a skill check. What's more, each skill is tied to one of your 6 ability scores: strength, dexterity, charisma, intelligence, wisdom, etc., right? And when you make a certain skill check, you receive a bonus, or sometimes a penalty if you have a low ability score, to that check, depending on your ability score that corresponds to that skill. For example, your acrobatic skill corresponds to your dexterity ability score. And so when you are making an acrobatics skill check, you would receive a bonus to that skill check if you have a high dexterity. And especially if you are proficient in that skill, you would get to also add your proficiency bonus, right? In addition, your stealth skill and your sleight of hand skill are also tied to your dexterity and would receive a similar bonus if you were trying to be stealthy, or if you're trying to pickpocket somebody with a sleight of hand skill check, right? Your charisma score, on the other hand, is tied to your deception skill, your performance skill, and your persuasion skill. Let's go back to that example that we used earlier about the character who wanted to try and persuade the bartender to let them have their drinks for free, right? The way that really would have worked in game would have been like this. You would have told the DM what you wanted to do. I want to try and persuade the bartender to give me my drinks for free. And your DM would have said something like, make me a persuasion check. You need a 15 or better because he's grumpy, right? So let's say you roll the d20 and you get a 12. But again, you have a 16 charisma, which gives you a +3 to your persuasion skill. And as that's the skill that corresponds to charisma. What's more, you took the mercenary veteran background. And as such, not only do you have an idea as to what your character's history consists of, they're a mercenary veteran, and that's going to help you create your story, but mercenary veterans also get proficiency in the athletics skill and the persuasion skill, meaning that you get to add your proficiency bonus to the roll. You're making a persuasion check, so you get a bonus based on your charisma, and because you're proficient in persuasion, you get to add your proficiency bonus also, okay? As a level 1 character, again, your proficiency bonus is 2, so now on that attempt to persuade the bartender to give you your drinks for free, you would get to add a total of 5 to the roll, 3 for your charisma, and 2 because you're proficient in the persuasion skill. So this means you would have succeeded on your persuasion check, even if you had only rolled as low as a 10, right? Because you needed a 15 and you get to add 5. Throughout the game, and especially when you're not in combat, most of the time that you try to do something that does not involve attacking an enemy, your DM will ask you to make a skill check. So it's important to figure out which skills you want your character to be proficient in, as so much of the game actually takes place outside of combat. These skills are generally pretty self-explanatory. If you want to be knowledgeable about the religions of your fantasy world, make sure that you're proficient in the religion skill, right? If you want to be a peerless athlete, make sure that you are proficient in the athletics skill, etc., etc. Also, I didn't want to talk about this earlier for fear of information overload. You're probably thinking, yeah, we're there. So each class and race also come with a selection of skills to choose from that you can be proficient in. So most characters actually start the game with 4 or 5 skills that they are proficient in. So choose wisely. In addition to skills, your background will sometimes give you additional languages that you can speak and understand and read. Most sentient creatures in the world will speak a language called Common, but sometimes it might be handy to know how to speak Goblin, let's say, if you want to spy on a group of enemy goblins and find out what their plans are to attack the nearby village, or to speak Dwarven if you want to have an easier time convincing a group of dwarves to somehow aid you in your quest. After your background is chosen, I would advise you to write your character's backstory. You've been given a thread to start weaving, so weave. Again, don't feel pressure to make it overly complex, but do know that the more detail that you give your character when you're creating kind of what their life was like before this adventure you're about to embark on began, the more personal that character will feel for you, and the more hooks you'll give a good DM to potentially draw upon as they weave the tapestry of the story that you will be telling together. That's it for Course 102. It was a lot of information, I know. Feel free to rewatch the video a time or two as you go through the process of creating your character, and of course draw upon the player's handbook, as we've mentioned, for additional detail and review. As always, my office door is wide open, so don't hesitate to ask any questions you may have in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. Your homework assignment for this week is to create a character. It's due Monday. It's worth 25% of your grade. So get started on that. Let me know what questions you may have. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for the next course, 103, where we will delve more deeply into combat. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.